I am Sushant Singh. I took premature retirement as a lieutenant colonel from the Indian Army in 2014. So the decision to join the army was taken at a very young age. I joined the military academy at the age of 20 after finishing my graduation, completing my undergrad from Agra University, a public university in India. There was no family background with the military per se, although my father had gone for his medical training. He's a doctor, to the Armed Forces Medical College, but he had never served in the military. Essentially, when I passed out of the university, India was still in the stage where it was a very controlled economy. The private sector had not really come in, and the economic reforms had not taken place. There were limited opportunities available to a young man at that time, and most of them were either in the government or in public sector. At that stage, the army or the military seemed a very exciting career to me, and that was primarily the reason: good status, good standing in the society, and an exciting career for a young man. That's what primarily led me to choose to join the army at that young age.
Right, and could you tell me just specifically what year you decided to join?
So I joined the army in 1992, the training academy in 1992, but clearly the exams, the entrance exams and the interviews, etc. had taken place in 1991.
Right, and so you went into the academy, did you want to be a career military officer, or did you just want it to be kind of a starting point and transition to something else?
So in India, when you join the military academy itself, and there are two types of military academies, whether you want to be a short service officer, which is a 5-year tenure, or you want to be a career officer. The academy that I chose to go to, that is the Indian Military Academy in Dehradun, is only for people who want to become a career military officer. So yes, at that point in time, I thought that I would be a career military officer.
So how long was it until after you joined the academy that you saw your first deployment?
So after joining the academy, the training goes on for 18 months. I joined the military academy in 1992, in July 1992. After I passed out from the military academy in December 1993, I went for a short training course because I was in the Corps of Engineers, sappers, what we do, the EOD and bridging, the explosive and ordnance disposal and communication. I went to undertake another training, post-commissioned officer training, as what is called as the young officers course. Came and joined my unit in the western town of Kota in Western India. That was in July 1994, and by September 1994, my unit had been moved to Kashmir, particularly to the place called Srinagar, its capital, Kashmir's capital, which was in the grip of a massive insurgency at that point in time. So yes, within approximately 2 years and 3 months of my joining the academy, I was seeing full-fledged action in Kashmir.
Could you describe some of the conditions? What were they like in Kashmir?
So in Kashmir in the early 90s, it was a very tough period in Kashmir. Militancy was at its peak. There were a large number of militants which were coming in from Pakistan, from what is Pakistani-controlled Kashmir across the line of control. There was no civilian government in place. The democratically elected government had gone away, and the situation was very, very, very tough. The unit had moved as part of a regular deployment, but the kind of area that it had to cover and the kind of support that it had to provide to other frontline units, it was pretty tough. You had these IEDs, improvised explosive devices, all over the place, which had to be diffused. You had challenges with bridges which had been burned down by militants so that the army could not chase them. Security forces could not chase them on vehicles. Those bridges had to be reconstructed. Getting out of your unit lines was always a challenge. You required a quick reaction team of around 20 people to get out, even for the smallest of things. There was no support from the civilians. Winning the hearts and minds of the local population was very tough. It was a very, very tough period with a large number of militants, lot of action, and with little support from the civilian staff and no democratic government in place. It was a very tough period as a military officer, but I was too young to realize at that point in time that it was this tough and this was not the norm. when this is nearly your first posting or your first experience in operational area, you start presuming that this is how the army is and this is how every theater is. But that was not true, as I was to learn later.
And I'm curious to know a little bit more about the interactions with the civilian population. Like, could you tell me just about your personal interactions with the civilian population?
So the civilian population at that time was being caught between the military and the militants. The armed militants were equally aggressive, equally punishing of anyone whom they believed was not listening to them. The military, of course, under pressure, was equally harsh, equally strong armed measures were being used. And this had put the civilians in a very difficult situation. They were weak. They did not have any weapons or anything to take either the militants or the military, and they would want to be left alone in a sense. They would want to be just not be put under any kind of pressure by the military or the militants. And the military very clearly was a powerful instrument, and the usual response from civilians when you interacted with them was to keep you at bay in some way, was not to really engage with you, was to just get rid of you as quickly as they could. They didn't want to offend you, but they didn't want to be friendly with you.
Do you feel that at the time that the situation was getting better during your presence there? Did you feel like the Indian military had good control over the situation, or was it just the same over the time there?
No, the Indian Army actually made a huge difference during that period when I was there. I was there for 3 years, from 1994 to 1997. In 1996, parliamentary polls were held in Kashmir. Although the voting percentages were very, very low, polling percentages were very, very low, those elections made a huge difference. And when the assembly elections or the local parliamentary election, local Congress elections were held in Kashmir the same year, that made a huge difference. It clearly showed that the situation had improved to an extent where elections could be held, where people could come out and vote, and a democratically representative government could be formed in the area. It does not mean that violence had completely been eradicated, no, but it only meant that the situation had improved to an extent where elections could be held and a civilian government could function.
Did you have any direct experiences with the insurgents there, or was it a lot of dealing with the aftermath of their attacks on the bridges and their explosive devices?
So in my case particularly, there was no direct encounter with the militants, but yes, a lot of diffusing the improvised explosive devices or dealing with reconstruction of bridges, because the encounters with militants were led by infantry. But yes, our base would often come under firing from the militants. We would always be part of teams which were coming under militant firing or attack, but never in the sense was a part of an active operation where I was chasing a militant or gunning a militant down.
Is there any particular standout experience from your time in Kashmir that you'd like to share?
In terms of a young military officer, the experience and the exposure of dealing with all kinds of improvised explosive devices was a huge challenge, and to deal with those new devices, and especially because in the early 90s, particularly the Indian Army had not dealt with these kind of weapons, these kind of instruments of attack, and to deal with them, to diffuse them without having been adequately trained or prepared to do so was very, very challenging. And we were really dealing with a large number of IEDs all over the Kashmir Valley.
You mentioned that you were there for 3 years, and in your first deployment. What was the subsequent action after that? After 1997, did you go to Kashmir again, or did you what was your next move in the military?
So of course, there's a whole sequence in the military where they try and push you for one operational posting and then a couple of non-operational or peace postings in that sense. The next operational task that I did was in 2001 when India mobilized its army against Pakistan. after Pakistan, terrorists coming out of Pakistan had attacked the Indian Parliament. There had been a major attack on Indian Parliament in 2001, and after that, the Indian Army was mobilized for more than 7-8 months. It almost seemed that we were about to go to war with Pakistan. So a lot of mine laying was done, a lot of obstacles were done, a lot of work was done. It was in the deserts of Rajasthan that I was posted during that time when we were mobilized. And after that, I came to Kashmir, but to a different area in 2003 on the line of control, where the Indian Army was constructing a fence on the line of control, making a fence, and I was part of the team which was making a fence on the line of control. I again came back to the same operational area in 2008, and when I was posted to a place called Dras, where the 1999 Kargil war had taken place. It was a very tough area, the second coldest inhabited place in the world, at very tough heights. The temperatures really dipped. The place was shut down for 6 months because of snow. It was again a very tough experience. Those were the 3 or 4 main operational tasks that I performed when I was in the army, other than the one when I was with the United Nations as a military observer in Côte d'Ivoire in 2005 and 6, and where we had a very tough time. I particularly had a very tough time because of being attacked by government forces, the government-backed militia in Côte d'Ivoire, where we had to be evacuated to Banjul in Gambia because we were all under attack. And as you know, UN military observers do not carry any weapon, do not have any military support. They are actually only in uniform but without any weapons, so as to generate confidence on both sides. That was one of the toughest experiences, especially in a francophone country with my linguistic skills not being that great, to deal with government-backed militia in a foreign land without any weapon, without any support.
Right. I wanted to ask more about the UN mission. Could we back up for a second? Could you tell me about what your process was like for being selected for that mission? Did you volunteer for that, or was it just selected randomly?
So for the UN mission, there's a very tough selection process in the Indian Army. You have to go through you have to be first selected for a set of interviews. 3 people are called for every vacancy for an interview. I was selected for that, and I made it through the interview process. And that's how I went as a military observer to Côte d'Ivoire.
And you were interviewed by the UN Commission?
No, interview was done by the Indian Army. So Indian Armies allocated certain vacancies, and there is a team of Indian Army officers, a Lieutenant General, a Major General, etc., who sit down and interview the people and then select them.
And were you part of a multinational force in Côte d'Ivoire, or just with the Indian Army contingent?
Yes, so I was part of there was no Indian Army contingent in Côte d'Ivoire. I was part of a multinational force. UN military observers usually operate as a team. And in Côte d'Ivoire, we used to have a team of 10 officers from 10 different countries. So you would have an Irish, a Ghana, a Brazilian, a European, all kinds of people, a Pakistani, a Bangladeshi, a Nepalese, all kinds of people would be there in that team.
So could you explain a little bit more, because I'm not familiar about what was the UN's mission in Côte d'Ivoire?
The UN mission in Côte d'Ivoire was a ceasefire between the rebels and the government forces, which had been fighting for a long period of time. And there was a French force, Licon, which was there as well, because Côte d'Ivoire was a former French colony, and the UN mission UN task was to bring peace, was to mandate to keep the ceasefire going, so that eventually it could lead to elections and election of and a new government in whole of Côte d'Ivoire. So Côte d'Ivoire had been divided between the east and the west, rather north and the south, where the north was being controlled by the rebels, where the south was being controlled by the state forces. The whole idea was, and there was a ceasefire line in between, and the whole idea was to bring the two parts together to get the ceasefire going, and eventually that did happen. And I think around a decade back, the UN forces are no longer in Côte d'Ivoire. Côte d'Ivoire has a full-fledged elected government, and the then President Laurent Gbagbo is now being tried at the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. And when I was there, he used to be the president of Côte d'Ivoire.
So could you tell me a little bit about your interactions with the civilians of Côte d'Ivoire?
So that job required a lot of interaction with civilians, because we were primarily going into villages, we were primarily going into areas where you were dealing with all kinds of people, It was tough to interact. My French was not really, and is still not very good. And it was a francophone country, so but you had officers from francophone countries who could speak in French. So we would go and interact with them. It was a very poor country. Particularly, the war had really wreaked havoc on the country. The interactions, people's expectations from the UN were usually to look for more help, more aid, more relief. But there was no material that the UN forces had to distribute. So neither in terms of medical aid or in terms of food grains or in terms of whatever, clothing, etc. There was nothing that the UN military observers had. So it was quite challenging to deal with the civilian population and meet their expectations in a UN mission. But equally challenging was to deal with the rebels, to deal with the government-backed militias, who all had their own interests, their own way in which they would, conduct criminal activities, extortion, grab money on checkpoints, etc. And it was very difficult to deal with them, to take a straight line, because we had no weapons, etc. We could report a lot, but then those reports would come back to the rebels, and then the rebels would come and threaten you. So it was pretty challenging. You also dealt with civilians in areas where you lived. So as a UN military observer, you live on your own within the town in which you are there. So I was in two towns, first in Bondoku, then in Segala, and in both these towns you lived in a house which you had rented from someone, and you would interact a lot with civilians when you were staying in those areas. What stayed with me was the fact that it was a very poor country where people were really suffering heavily because of the war, and there was little that the international community was doing to alleviate their suffering by providing them whether food grains or education or medicines or jobs, whatever that the case may be.
You mentioned earlier that there were government forces that were conflicting with the UN. Could you describe that a little more in your experience?
Yeah. So what happens is when the UN took a call which went against the government at the time, the government would not fight on its own. They would put out their affiliated militias who would come out and attack you. So they would lay siege on your buildings. They would throw petrol bombs at you. They would throw Molotov cocktails at you. They would virtually lay siege, and you would not know how to respond because you cannot go back to the place where you're staying, and you're worried because in a UN compound, there are all kinds of people. There are electoral teams which are full of women. There are UN police officers which have women with their women and armed women, etc. So it's quite a crazy situation where you have this host of people who are trying to bully you, have laid siege on your building, in your office, and are trying to virtually kill you. And people were killed during one of those sieges in at that time. And this was a regular feature. Every time the government did not like something that the international community did, the brunt was borne by the UN teams which were there in that country.
And was it a controversial decision to not have the UN outfit with weapons, or?
So the UN works in various ways. There are UN military contingents which carry weapons, which are fully equipped, which have everything from tanks to Humvees to everything. And then there are UN military observers who are supposed to observe both sides, and so that they are able to deal with both sides. And to generate confidence in both sides, they are not supposed to carry weapons. That has been historically how the military observers have operated in the UN system starting from 1948. And so that's why, because as a military observer, it was a much higher post in that sense, much more responsible position than a military contingent, where you were operating like you would operate anywhere else. To keep your neutrality and to keep your confidence and trust, so that people from both sides trust you. One did not operate with the contingent. One operated on its own, so that people trusted you on both sides, and you could perform that job.
And how long were you in Cote d'Ivoire?
I was there in Cote d'Ivoire for a year, which included 1 month where I was evacuated. A lot of us were evacuated to a place called Banjul in Gambia.
After that deployment in Cote d'Ivoire, you went back and you were still serving in the Indian military?
Yeah, so I did. I continued serving in the Indian military. In fact, the Indian military had a 5-year contract with you that you could not quit after you had gone and done a UN assignment. So there was no way I one could have quit. But I went back and to the military, and as I mentioned, I was posted a few years later in 2008-9 to a place called Dras, which is in the high Himalayas, again on the Pakistan border in Kashmir, in northern Kashmir. And this is the same area where a war between India and Pakistan had taken place in 1999. And it was a tough area, as I mentioned earlier, with very cold climates, very high altitude, 14,000 feet, 15,000 feet, and that kind of situation. Sub-zero temperatures, really, really, really. It's the second coldest inhabited place in the world after Siberia. Very tough area the living conditions were itself very tough, although there was no firing going on at that time between India and Pakistan after they had agreed to a ceasefire in 2003. But just the idea that you had to live there, survive there with no food. So, helicopters could come once in 15-20 days to support you, because the weather would pack up. There was no way you could reach that area. So if somebody had a medical contingency, there was no way they could be picked out and taken to a hospital, because it was all snowbound, and the living conditions were very, very tough. So yeah, that is what I remember from my posting in Dras.
Did you have any interactions with the Pakistani troops in that area, or?
No, there was no interaction with the Pakistani troops in that area. Unfortunately, on the line of control, there's hardly any interaction with the Pakistani troops. You can see them, you can look at them, they can look at you, but you don't go out and shake hands or talk to them. My interaction with Pakistani soldiers and officers was in the UN, where there was a Pakistani contingent, as well as much later when I, as a journalist, went to Pakistan.
I'm curious to know, you served in the UN with Pakistani soldiers. Did that hinder your relationship, the fact that you served near the line of control in Kashmir? Or?
Did that strain my relationship? No. I think it didn't affect people. People saw each other as professional soldiers who were doing a professional job in their armies, and now we were here with the UN and doing their own job. In fact, I shared a house with a Pakistani and a Bangladeshi officer in one of my team sites, because there were very few limited houses that were available to rent in a small town. So you would rent a house, and where each one of you would take a room. So I shared a house with a Pakistani officer. We would probably eat on the same dining table, sit in the same living room. So, but you treated each other as a professional soldier who was doing a professional job, and not look at it through the eyes of India-Pakistan. And you would generally try and avoid an India-Pakistan discussion there, a political discussion in that sense, where you either of you would get into some kind of slanging match or in an argument.
And what influenced your decision to leave the Indian military?
So I had enough from of my experiences with the Indian military. There were a couple of factors. One was a very personal factor, the fact that my family had a very unsettled life. My daughter, by the time she was in, I think, grade 5 or something, had seen some 7 schools. Had changed 7 schools by then. It was very tough in that sense. It was very tough on my children. I had a very young son at the time, and a slightly older daughter. It was tough on them. And that was the main reason why I thought I needed to move, to give them a more stable life, to give them a more comfortable life. I also thought that I could look at fresher challenges, newer challenges, and do something more than just being in the army. I thought I had seen enough of action, etc. And there was much more in the world which I needed to do before I really, missed that bus in terms of age, etc. So I quit the army after 20 years of service.
And after 20 years of service, did your view of the military change from when you went in to when you left?
Yes, of course. In 20 years is a long time. You see the organization from inside, and when you see an organization from inside, you of course become more critical of the organization. So yes, my views, which were much more, at 20 I was very young, my views about the military were almost rose-tinted in a certain way. I was looking at them through rose-tinted glasses. In 20 years, you've seen a lot, and you're perhaps more cynical, more real about what an organization is and what the job is.
And I guess lastly, I'm kind of curious, did your role in the Indian military, did that affect your decision to go into journalism?
Not actually, but it helped me a lot in my journalistic career, because that's one thing where I started with a certain amount of expertise and reputation based on my experience and my knowledge. which proved very handy for me as a journalist. So people would generally respect me or consider me as someone who was talking from a position of authority. It was very helpful for me to have been in the army journalist. Over and above that, the fact that army, for a young man like me coming from a small town in India, the army showed me the world. It taught me how to deal with the world. It gave me very vast experiences. It gave me great exposure. It allowed me to deal with all kinds of situations. So whether I went into journalism or into a corporate role or into think tank or coming and teaching at Yale, the fact that I was in the army has helped me not only in terms of the knowledge, etc., that I gained, but also in terms of being able to deal with various situations and various contingencies. I think that's the lasting legacy of my tenure with the army.
Thank you very much. This takes care of many of my questions. So
thank you. Thank you.